So the PS752 case is completely unprecedented example in many aspects, for which no independent criminal or technical investigation has been conducted. Are there any hopes that the International Court can maybe initiate such investigation? If not, how is it possible to conduct investigations that are independent?
It's a really tough question.
I know. I left it for the end.
Yeah. So part of this stems, and this is a little bit in the weeds of the development in international law, but part of the difficulty here stems from the fact that over the last 100 years, the world has been on a journey in which international law has transformed itself from purely obligations between countries in which they don't look at the conduct of governments inside countries in respect of their own citizens or their activities within their own borders, to the increasing development of international law that binds governments' actions even with, or applies to governments' actions even within their own borders. And that project, I'd say, is still underway. It's incomplete. It sort of began post-World War II. I mean, it has its origins before World War II, but it picked up steam much more earnestly after World War II with the development of international human rights instruments. That is a very legalistic background, but that is to lay the foundation to say that the problem that we have here is that the international legal system is not properly constructed to deal with the issue of a military, elements of a military shooting down a civilian airliner within the country's own borders. And so we're left with the circumstance of trying to figure out how to best address it. And so we have the avenue through the International Court of Justice, which can find that Iran failed to conduct its own proper domestic criminal investigations as it is obliged to do under the 1971 Montreal Convention, but the ICJ doesn't have the capacity to ensure that those investigations are actually conducted. Compliance, there's no international army to ensure or enforce compliance with the ICJ's rulings or with the requirements of the Montreal Convention. I'd say the best hope for an actual criminal investigation outside of Iran's hands is probably through some combination of Ukraine and Canada acting on the one hand and the International Criminal Court acting on the other hand. And then if we are actually looking to Iranian authorities to conduct a fair and impartial criminal investigation, I think some changes are going to need to happen to see that take place. But those are the avenues that I see, and it's really, I appreciate it's a complex and not entirely satisfying answer, but it's sort of the state of the international legal system as we have it.
For sure. And when you look back at what happened in case of Air India Flight 182, for example, that took 20 years for the victims' families to have a public inquiry.
Yeah, and it took 20 years to have a public inquiry, and there's a couple even key distinguishing factors there, right? That was a flight from Canada departing from Montreal, I believe.
The Air India was from Vancouver. Yeah.
It was a terrorist bombing over the North Atlantic Ocean, and so there was more information, more control in Canada's hands, and less obstruction from other international actors. I think it was a situation involving more a pure act of terrorism, which is not virtuous by any means, but is in some ways easier for the international system to deal with in this circumstance because there's no one really standing in the way of the investigation.
And yet another reason for the IRGC's importance of it being claimed as a terrorist organization, I would say, as the body that shot the plane. And I guess what happened, or was this something similar that happened to the Pan Am Flight 103, that the case in Lockerbie, that was a tragedy, was that with similar circumstances?
I think there's differing views on that. That I think is a degree closer to the circumstance of PS 752, not the same circumstance, but that was several, I guess, Libyan terrorists who, about a decade or more later, it came out had links to the Libyan government itself that conducted a terrorist act on board that Pan Am flight that exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland. But really, even there, we see that the resolution to that issue took more than a decade, and was ultimately a political resolution more than a legal resolution. It took various United Nations sanctions against Libya, which were enacted in part for this reason, but in part because of Libya's other conduct that had offended the international system.
I have a question too.
Oh, sure. Go ahead. Yes, go ahead. By all means.
When I was reading the application this morning, Ryan, I noticed the word extradition of the offenders or perpetrators of this crime. What do you think about that cover of you? Is it going to happen, you think?
I wish I had a crystal ball. I don't know. But Iran does have the obligation remember, the ICJ is adjudicating obligations under the 1971 Montreal Convention, and so not to be overly legalistic, but the two countries that under that convention have the obligation of criminal prosecution are Ukraine and Iran, and so I see that the term extradition in that instrument, there might be other context I'm missing, but I see that as primarily related to an obligation that Iran has to cooperate with Ukraine in respect of a criminal investigation and extradite individuals that may be charged to Ukraine for trial.